All right, so we're live now, but we don't have any people showing up because I'm going to copy and paste this link to everyone out there. So bear with me if you're watching this on repeat and you've got this video. Cool. So whilst I'm tutoring around with this, getting the link to all you guys live, I'm just going to spring it onto Klaus here to just start talking about something as I do this. How about what we've been up to this month? You know, go along with that as I go back and forth with the link for them, so everyone's joining.
Okay, we have been planting on those rows in the old orchard that you have seen on the last video. So we do that always a bit by piecemeal. And at the same time as we do in permaculture, we try to double and triple task. There was a grader here that repaired the road of the whole community, and they didn't bring a digger sort of road soil, the gravel and the topsoil they scraped off the edges because the whole valley doesn't spray, so there's always kikuyu on the edges. So I slowly scooped it up into bags and take it to planting places just because it has to come out of the ditch, otherwise we're going to destroy the road. And then this sort of gravel topsoil mix is quite nice in planting holes. Only downside is, of course, it has kikuyu in most places where it grew in the sun. And so we can only use it in places where we have kikuyu already. Otherwise, it would be not a very smart thing to do. But of course, you could trust all your Chitonia that you put around a place that surely. But yeah, just be a bit aware. And yeah, so we have been doing that and still cleaning up on top of the hill where we had Tony, our arborist woofer, drop a few problem trees for us in the past. So we finally got into cleaning most of that up, ready for more contour or off-contour planting way up on the hill, where we go into a more Mediterranean style, dry, high wind exposure food forest, and see how that's going to be like. So how are you going there, Frida?
Good, just sending out the live Q&A to all messages. Hopefully we'll have some people trickling through shortly. Cool. All right, where are we? Here we go.
Should we go through the questions that we have already?
Yeah, might as well, I guess. Hey. Yep, so we got 3 people on board. Yay, cool. So people are starting to see the links now. Hi, Liz. Awesome. Yeah, happy Sunday to you too. So we've got some questions already on our Patreon comment page, so we'll start going through those. But as you hop on, guys, just, yeah, introduce yourself as to what region, climate you're in, and your questions, so we can sort of answer your questions in relation to where you're from. So, yeah, start rolling those through on the live chat on the right there. And we'll begin with the questions that were asked on the comment section of our live Q&A post. So first up we had, let me just get that up. We had,
That's Briar.
Briar. We had Briar asking, I'm starting a food forest on clay and kikuyu in Northland, still observing wind, etc., to know what to put in. But should I just plant the area into Tonia for now? So that's kikuyu Northland. I can recall from our exchange with you, Briar, that you were out in Patawa, and so that's clay, isn't it? Out that way. So clay. So we're picturing clay, kikuyu smothered area, and you're asking what would be the best approach to get that out of that current situation and into a food forest, I imagine. So yeah, the question being, should she first go out and just plant the whole thing out with the Tonia? How would you go about that?
Kia ora, Briar. Yeah, so you could come from the angle of you don't have time to deal with it all at once, or you want to observe still and want to take it easy until you know exactly where you want to put your valuable trees, in what direction, and this and that. Being in Parua Bay, I imagine that you would have quite a few slopes on there. So the direction in that case, I would personally always go with contour, even so it has its downsides. But I think there are too many upsides for going on contour or close to contour to ignore when you are on a slope. I've explained enough of that in recent videos. So that gives you already the direction for Tithonia. And absolutely, Tithonia would be always a sink for this climate, this soil, the first choice whilst you're still thinking what else to do. Another option, of course, would be elephant grass. And you could have them alternating as well. But either of them would work on their own, but they would also work together, alternating in rows, ideally on contour, slightly off contour. And then you might want to have generous rows of grass in between. If you can bring a tractor in between those rows, then keep it to a tractor width. If you want to do one more mowing or a few more mowings in the Kikuyu, that you would keep in between. But you have already the Tithonia in the rows, and now you're open to different directions to go from here. If it is fenced in, you could at any time pull the plug on it and say, okay, enough of that now, let's get rid of it or set it back. And I want to do something else completely with it, or I want to go back to all grass, or I want to add more trees. Whatever you might want to do in the dry season, you could bring in cows to reduce it on a big scale for you. And then you come in with your trees after that if you wish, or no cows and you go in with a machete and do that. So you could use the Tithonia to prepare a big area in case you don't have the time to do it all already, or because you are still cautious, you want to focus on some obvious areas and want to observe what else is going on. In both options, covering the place with Tithonia, with elephant grass, maybe even throw in some a brush bottle, dare I say that. But these are all plants that you could let the cows loose on it in the worst case scenario if you can't handle it anymore. And if you do that often enough, you get rid of it. If at any time you feel like you did the wrong thing there. But you can also add the trees in there after nice setbacks, and then you just have to be quite hard on it and more frequently, because it would be more stronger established than the trees you put in later, which means it bounces back much faster after prunings, immediately shading out the other trees and so on that you might want to include then. So you might have to face to do more frequent pruning, like interim prunings on your banner grass or Tithonia in that case, between the major pruning where you prune everything. Yeah, just to stop them from overwhelming the system. That's how I would envision that. I hope that answers that one.
So to summarize that, for the people that have jumped on since, we're answering a question regarding an existing Kikuyu covered clay area and whether or not she should go ahead with the Tithonia, smother it all with Tithonia to get it out of that stage. So class is just saying, on a broad scale like this, Tithonia is a great aid to plaster the system with, or plaster the area with Tithonia, which will chemically and via shade get rid of the Kikuyu. But in regards to that, you have to juggle around what your next succession phase is. So it's great as a broad acre solution to cover it with the Kikuyu, but then we can sort of work with either cows to do some areas, or do it in stages and then do cows in the other areas that you haven't done the Tithonia yet, do the Tithonia in smaller areas. But if you do go large scale with Tithonia first as an interim sort of stage and then come in with your fruit trees, class was just mentioning about chopping it back so that you have enough light for then the other trees to come through. I'm summarizing it in almost as long way as you just explained.
Maybe just something, when we talk broad acre, people easily make then the conclusion, oh, then we just plant it all sort of as it comes along, sort of thing. You need to still keep in mind your maintenance options of, can I bring a tractor in? Then you want these lines to be parallel. If you want the 3 lines on a slope being parallel, then you cannot be exactly contour, because then they're sort of different spaces, which is annoying when you mow in between. So in this case, you stay key line, they're parallel, not exactly contour, but that can be beneficial anyway. And you think more about key line plowing sort of things, key lines of 3 rows. Then you have equal distance if you want to bring machinery in of some sorts, but you want those kikuyu strips. Don't be worried about leaving those kikuyu strips. They will disappear sooner or later anyway. You don't have to feel like you have to cover it so dense right away that there's no kikuyu left. You don't want kikuyu left in the rows, but between the rows, the kikuyu will give you a nice thread to work between the rows without doing much soil damage. And once Tithonia will close in the rows, you will see for a while there's not much soil cover. You have suddenly bare soil. So the grass rows in between, they give you that capture of the running of topsoil and litter that can happen. And over time, these kikuyu rows almost by the change over into ryegrass or cocksfoot rows because of the lack of the sun. But you can have them transitioning as you use them for mowing or grazing or whatever you do in those rows. So don't immediately get rid of a whole big block of kikuyu by planting everything too dense as a block. That would be my advice on the slope. That's my learning over the last few years.
Cool. If you want any extensions of that, Briar, or specific details, remember we're here for a while now. So if you want to put through any more clarification questions through that, welcome to. Our next question is
Fernanda from Panama. Piera Fernanda.
So I'm just going to do a little technical note to class here. I just got a comment from someone saying about the volume. So there's little green lines there. So we've got to try and get the speak up so that some people don't have sound issues. Cool. So Ferranda, location facts. So he's in Panama, Pacific coast, altitude about 300,000 millimeters rainfall throughout the year, and has 3 months of dry season. The soil is mostly silt with some clay. Question about waterlogging. Would you consider proper amendment to be biochar, compost, and coarse sand? What are your thoughts in using horse or cow poop as amendment? Any chance you will be making biochar? Also, any special thoughts on heavy mulching in the tropics? Thanks. Cool, so let's break that up. So we're saying dry season, silty, and some clay. So that's sort of what you've been experienced with in Bolivia, I suppose, that sort of dry season and silty clay. And about waterlogging, would you consider the amendments to avoid waterlogging to be biochar, compost, and coarse sand?
Right. Okay. Fernanda is not on live now. That's
but he'll be watching it.
Yeah. But I can't get comments back from Fernanda now. So I make some assumptions here now, and that is if the land that Fernanda is talking about is not having a high water table, so if it's not flat, if it has a gradient and it still has a 3 meter rainfall, and we get waterlogging on a soil that is not flat and swampy, then with silt and a small clay content, that should be free draining. If it's not free draining, if it's waterlogging, that means that the soil is compacted either by machinery or by heavy use or misuse, whatever in the past. So that is something that plants would be able to fix. A lot of our soils here on the slope, they're pure clay, 100% clay. They used to be waterlogging. Now they're not, because the water can wick through the landscape. And as long as water is on the move and not become stagnant, it is actually not toxic, and hence we don't get the waterlogging problem as if the water is not moving out of landscape. So then amendments. So when you do a syntropic row of any sorts, you want to put any amendments in that you have available without too much sacrifice of money or time for the only first installation. After that, it should run on its own. If you then feel like you need manure, you need more compost or anything like that, that would be an indicator that there's something not optimum in your design or management. You should be able to get out of that the first year. The amendments in the first year is the Kickstarter, and that gives you the payback of the vegetables and so on that you put in as a quick first crop or income right in the beginning. They need this extra type of fuel, but from there on it should run on its own improvement. And yes, put everything and you get your hands on that you can afford. And in terms of charcoal compared to compost, if you do have drainage issues, the compost will be gone in a year, and that drainage, if you still need it, would be gone then too. The biochar, however, on the sand, they will stay, they will improve the soil texture, but you have a silty soil, you should not need sand. Charcoal is always good for all sorts of other reasons as well, internal surface, nutrient holding, and all these sort of things. However, don't hold back saying, I should plant something now, I could plant something now, but I can't because I don't have the biochar right now. I first have to make biochar. So don't fall into that trap. Everything else about planting and getting on with it and so on is more important than did you get enough biochar or not, right? You can always go in later and make the odd hole and plant something that you missed, or bury something and chuck some charcoal into those holes as well. You can still retrofit charcoal thingy in patches, but you want to get on and get the plants pumping and put your energy and your money into that as a priority over trying to get it all right with the biochar and other amendments. If you have to divide your resources up, then always plants and now and mucho is more important than getting it all right with the amendments.
An extension of that question was, what are your thoughts in using horse or cow poo as an amendment?
That was the same question.
Oh, you went through that. Okay.
Yeah, or maybe I just explained on that. So when you do plant things and you use compost and you are on a soil that has a lot of rainfall and therefore possible waterlogging, watch out. If you make planting holes and you fill them up with a lot of compost, the compost then will shrink pretty quick. Your whole fluff that you put in the planting hole will shrink with the first few rains. Compost evaporates, and then suddenly you find your trees 30 centimeters below the soil level, and then you run big time into trouble with most trees. They don't like it. Grasses and monocots in general don't have an issue with that. Yeah, bananas, who cares? But your trees, especially grafted trees and fruit trees, more delicate trees, you will drown in a hole that starts slumping. So in those cases, try to build your planting hole upwards, make it fill it proud rather than already starting even or even in the depth. There's no advantage in that unless you're in a desert. So keep that in mind. Go high. Obviously, the trouble then is that the tree can then sort of fall over in the wind. There's that danger, but those things usually get fixed with quick companion plants. Right? So there's another reason to have all these dense companion plants around your crop trees. They can give you that shelter against the pummeling in the wind in the beginning when you don't plant them too deep.
Which is another thing to keep in mind with hugelkultur, as some people do a methodology where they bury logs in the hole or a terrace that they've planted up, and that will mean that the soil will be heaped initially because you've got all the logs underneath and you've got all the soil above, so you've got a sort of more convex hole to start with, and as the logs below start to decompose, that soil will cave in, and so any trees that you have, they will then start sitting in this sort of caved in area, which if you've got trees that are sensitive to that moisture around the trunk, they won't be so happy. Bananas and all that, more sort of monocots that can handle mulch and heaping around them will be okay, but most of your trees will suffer a bit. So just another thing to be, wary about when you're exploring hugelkultur or any sort of burying of logs or organic matter in your planting hole, because that will, decompress. So then he just added, any chance you'll be sharing about making biochars a video? And we most certainly will.
We will. Yeah, we actually did already make a film recently, and then for some reason didn't use it. Probably didn't turn out right when we did the nighttime filming of the bathtub fully glowing, and we have another bathtub biochar action lined up. But so after this rain now, when it dries, we will get into that. So yeah, we will do that.
Also, any special thoughts on heavy mulching in the tropics? For this last question.
Okay, heavy mulching in the tropics. So that sounds like, or would I only need to mulch in dry areas to prevent evaporation, as we think as the main reason why we mulch, right? And there is a lot more to mulching than to prevent moisture loss. For us, for instance, the mulching is important, especially with the bigger pieces of wood and logs, that we can walk on the soil at this time of the year when the clay is fully saturated with water, and you tread on it and you squeeze the last bit of air out of it, and then it will take a year for it to expand again and suck in air. And we want to avoid that. And the logs and the branches that we put down, they do a great job exactly that. That's why we don't chip things. One of the reasons we don't chip things in the food forest, if we can avoid it. And then the logs we also use, the mulch logs we also use as a barrier against downhill movement of litter and water and all these sort of things. So there's that as well, of course. And you want all of those things in the tropics, and then especially in the tropics, when you have year-round moisture in the mulch, there is so much decomposition activity happening in the mulch that the roots of a lot of trees and bananas and so on, they will go right into the mulch layer and start taking out macromolecules of decomposing plant tissue. They don't wait for it to break down into ions or base nutrients. They actually can grab whole building blocks of polyphenols or proteins and make new substance with it. All of those things is possible, and of course the new findings about rhizophagy, where roots actually suck in microbes and digest them. So where do they find those microbes? They would find them mostly in mulch layers, for instance. So, and there's all of that. So yes, you do want a thick mulch layer in the tropics. You often don't find it in the tropics, in the forest, because it decomposes so fast under those conditions that it looks like there isn't much happening. But in your food forest, especially with syntropy, you can accelerate the production, the regrowth, so much that you still end up with a strong litter layer, much more than a natural forest would do. And it's quite amazing that you can improve on that. And that's where the extra productivity comes for our crops, that comes out of that system.
And that applies not only to tropical climates, but also subtropical and temperate as well.
Yes,
that mulch layer.
Yes, and it applies anywhere.
So we've got another question here from Michael from New South Wales. Cool subtropical climate at 800-meter altitude. Can you give an idea of how you might manage privet, broadleaf privet, and narrowleaf privet as biomass plants? They seed prolifically by birds and come up everywhere in the gardens, orchard, food forest, etc. And I am trying to change my mindset to see them as self-sown biomass plants, but need a few tips on managing them, i.e. frequency with which they should be pruned, and do I need to leave the lawn of little ones and come up as Do I just leave the lawn of little ones that come up as to pull them out create soil disturbance? Thanks. Cool. So privet.
Yeah. Hi, Michael. You probably have a similar climate to us, and we have privet in the wider neighborhood, not in our valley, but there's privet in a neighboring valley, and it's quite dominant. And in some, especially volcanic areas, it's quite prevalent. So. Priveted. And I think here it prefers the more free draining volcanic soils. And so I don't have first-hand experience on that, but I would still treat it like any other thing that is similar, be that the Queen of the Night or woolly nightshade, gorse, whatever. You end up having a lawn from certain managements, and now let's say you put your syntropy rose in that. So I guess you will have so much privet in the whole neighborhood that you won't get rid of it in the whole neighborhood. So you're probably just trying to get rid of it in your food forest. So since it is in your area and your food forest is not going to be the seed contributor for the area that everybody points the finger at, you can relax a bit about it. And say you have your syntropy rose that gives you an orientation between here and there. You have your privet lawn, and then in the rose you will have privet coming up, not as a lawn, it will start growing all with the other stuff. So what you do, and yes, you do want it as a weed that shows up and obviously has the right conditions to thrive there. So that's all what we want. However, privet is poisonous for animals. So say if eventually you want to feed some animals out of your food forest, you rather want to exchange it for something edible. And it might not be something you want in for the long term because you might feel embarrassed about it. So how do you eradicate it? Ripping it out is too tedious. And yes, it disturbs the soil and might bring other weeds that then germinate in those patches. That could be even worse. But what I suggest that you do, if you want to reduce it, you don't want to have it as dominant, and obviously it's already established, it might have strong root systems, whereas all the other things you bring in won't. So there's an unfair playing field there. So what you might need to do then with your management is, say your whole food forest, you give 2 to 3 managements with prunings, and for a couple of years you might have to invest doing an extra 1 or 2 prunings where you just prune the things that you don't want, that you want to sort of discriminate against somehow, and because they have too much of an advantage already being established. So you might want to choose the right tool. That could be like a battery-powered hedge trimmer, I could imagine would work well on your privet lawn. In the rows, you would be restricted to using a serrated sickle, or pruning saw, or maybe these miniature chainsaws that Stihl brought out. So there are a few options make your work easier. And you do that then, one pruning, just that. And remember in syntropy, where we have the effect where all you each other along and make them come back nicely together. So imagine what happens now to that poor privet, that you give a prune without pruning all the other ones. The privet will then drive the other ones, but nobody's driving your privet at the same time. So it would get exhausted. But meanwhile, you can still cream it for mulch, but eventually it will be at least equalizing with the others, and possibly even disappear. I mean, privet can handle a bit of shade, but it still needs some sun. So you might get rid of it that way, or at least you set it back. And of course, you don't want it to produce seeds. You don't want more in your neighborhood of that. So you definitely make sure it doesn't go to flower. And we do that anyway in Syntropy. So within your food forest, you should be phasing out of it just by observing these normal selective weeding, selective pruning strategies that we do for everything.
And just an extension of that note, a guy that I stayed with and did a course with in New South Wales, which you might know or might be interesting to get in touch with, is Scott Hall. And in his Syntropy lines in New South Wales, he had privet around the area, and with a Syntropy mindset, when you've got weeds in the area, you use what grows well, you observe the vegetation that wants to be there, and you manage it to get it out of that situation rather than try and, rip it out or take it out. So his philosophy was actually to realize that it did really well there. And again, in Syntropy mindset, you want things to do well to get it out of that situation and to help your then later plants to thrive and sort of pull them along. So we actually went along all his Syntropy lines in the 3-year Syntropy lines as well as his newly planted ones, and actually intentionally planted privet sticks because they grow from sticks as well.
Take that.
So he actually went about the other way. He actually said, oh, they grow really well. They are everywhere already. So I'm not introducing a pest. That's a whole different story. You wouldn't want to introduce it to another area. But they're growing there already. They're doing really well. And so he actually went around, got cuttings, and then planted them every 50 centimeters. And his trick was just to always keep them pruned. So again, managing them so they never go to seed and spread that way, like Klaus mentioned, and use them as a driver for the succession of your food forest. And like Klaus mentioned, they love full sun, can take partial sun, shade, but don't really like full shade. So it's perfect in the interim sort of first 1 to 5 years of the syntropic evolution. And then as your line gets more mature, that density of shade gets much more, and then as you're constantly pruning it, it just gets more and more stressed out and phases out. So he had successfully phased out of the privet rows that he intentionally planted, as well as then planting new ones. So yeah, it's a bit of hope for you on how to use that plant as a resource, as you've already nicely said in your message as well, of how to change that perspective of something that's rampant and thriving, and how do we harness that energy, how do we harness that success of that plant to then pull along and use it as biomass for your other plants. The only thing is that it's not that friendly to use with a machete. It's sort of quite wiry, so it wouldn't be my first choice as a biomass plant. Titonia and all that, it's much better. But yeah, if it's around your area and it's thriving, then by all means do use it as a biomass plant and just manage it, keep on top of it so it doesn't go to seed, but you're returning all that biomass back onto the ground and using that drive that it has to pull along all your other plants.
But it wasn't me that told you that you should plant privet. There was, Scott.
Someone else. Okay, so now we've got another question from Campbell. Hi there, I'm in Lincoln, Canterbury, about 30 minutes from Christchurch. Silt loam top, 500 millimeters, turning to hard clay with really hard pan at 1,000 millimeters. Temperate climate, 600 millimeters of annual rain, hot, dry summers. A few questions, all relevant to temperate climate. So for all those guys out there in temperate climates, perk your ears. So we've got a few questions. 1, 5 favorite biomass producers for a temperate climate. Go.
All right. So hi, Campbell. First of all, so you got a pan about 1 meter down, clay pan. I think otherwise it wouldn't be fair that you get all the rock dust and we have all the clay, and at least you have to have the pan then, I guess. And then you say there's sand underneath. So yeah, have you sort of actually drilling through that for certain trees? That's what they do up here with pot soils when they plant avocados. But with most trees, you probably would get away with that. But then your questions of the plants for your climate, I mentioned, but you also mentioned you want to push the boundaries. So I mean, give Titonia a try. If it's sheltered, a bit of microclimate, it might work. We get more and more surprises on that, and the climate trend is in our favor on that one. But otherwise, still think sunflower and find the sunflower that suits you. You definitely have to figure out which are the best or the two best sunflowers for you. So what is the favorite accumulator? It so depends on the time of the year, on your climate and soil. For instance, you could choose Yakong, might work for you. You push the boundaries and you have it in summer, it grows nice and strong and this and that. It's a nice mulch plant, gives you a bit of a crop. But in winter, in your climate, it will die back in early autumn and it comes up probably fairly soon, but it gives you nothing in winter. Whereas if you go for a sunflower like cardoon, cardoon is the more biomass producing cousin of the globe artichoke. You can eat the stalks as a vegetable and sort of a medicinal food. It grows like mad, summer and winter. I mean, sure, there's a lot of water in the leaves, so what the dry matter is, I don't know, but it makes nice fodder. A lot of animals appreciate it in some quantity as a fodder, so you give that biomass another use. But it makes also nice shelter, and it is just a beauty to look at. It seems to grow at the same speed summer and winter. So for your climate, that would probably be my favorite, would be cardoon. And Jerusalem artichoke, of course, but again, here we don't have the winter growth, but something more useful. So it's also a good biomass producer. So any of those sunflowers. And again, also as an annual, a sunflower should be part of the mix, ideally for you guys. Then there was
I'm writing notes.
favorite.
No, I'm writing them down as you go.
And there was the favorite dynamic accumulator. Well,
just before you go on to the next one, so just from what he's talked, so 5 favorite biomass plants for a temperate environment. We've listed Yacon, Titonia, pushing it, so Yacon if it's a bit too frosty for Titonia, cardoon, Jerusalem artichoke, cocksfoot, which we've mentioned a lot in our videos, very temperate, a big favorite of ours for biomass. And here I've just listed poplar as, your emergent, more of a tree canopy biomass plant that also takes a temperate zone. So that's your 5 for biomass producers. Now he's asked for 5 dynamic accumulators. Do you want to briefly explain what dynamic accumulators is before listing your 5?
Let's use an example, comfrey, dynamic accumulator. It is always mentioned as the accumulator. So when we talk about an accumulator, and sometimes people get the wrong idea when they hear that comfrey is a good dynamic accumulator for nitrogen, they think somehow it's a nitrogen fixer. It's not, but it can grab it whilst it's available in big quantities if it's available in big quantities and quickly turn it into leaf. So if you have a chicken run and you have nitrate runoffs and so you want to stop them from leaving the farm, comfrey is a good one to turn it quickly into something much more benign, useful, and then you can use that as a foliar spray and put it on your plants rather than using chicken manure directly if it's for eating fresh and so. And so you let the comfrey filter dubious runoffs into something clean and more user-friendly. Also, it can accumulate calcium in the soil and potassium and so on. However, it depends on the time of the year. In winter, comfrey gives you nothing. Yeah, so you could have your chicken run and you have nitrogen leaching out of it all 4 sides, and your comfrey is doing nothing to it. So what do you have in place that takes over? Are there any other good accumulators? Possibly sorrel is a good accumulator because it goes fast in winter. So it might not show up on anyone's list of dynamic accumulators, but in winter it is a good accumulator, and so is cardoon. So these categories that you put out there are actually kind of overlapping a bit in lots of plants, depending on how you look at them. A banana could be a dynamic accumulator. It quickly sucks up potash and nitrogen at the right time of the year. In winter, it doesn't do it.
And for a temperate climate, would you suggest Abyssinian bananas then as a to fill
They're not that much better, really,
Yeah.
for climate. No.
Right, so that's not quite
No.
relevant to a temperate climate.
I mean, if when we talk a dynamic accumulator, we often talk about forbs, yeah, in the sort of herb layer. So I think sorrel would be really out there, and then certain grasses, like again cocksfoot, it grows strong in winter. So what does it do? It accumulates nutrients in winter into its tissue, so they don't run off. And also they get them out of the soil. So I wouldn't get too fixed on what is classified as an accumulator, what is not. Whatever thrives, produces a lot of biomass at a certain time of the year, is a good accumulator, because they're all made out of potash and calcium and nitrogen, and mostly, and that's what you expect from a dynamic accumulator.
Like plantain could be another one, because that's really thriving in the winter as well.
Yeah, and I guess what you also want to see in a dynamic accumulator in the sort of sense is that you can prune them off and they come back, like comfrey does. The more you prune them, the more they come back. So canna lily would be another good one for that. And that gives you also a bit of a window into the cold season. They still hang on doing their stuff quite into the cold season, at least for us, maybe not for you, sorry. And another one that I mention it, but if you have it, don't look at it badly, because an amazing all year round accumulator is the giant reed. Yes, Arundodonus. Strong winter grouse, comes back, as you know, from pruning big time, and it is traditionally used in grey water systems because it also has a strong cleaning effect, and even on a bacterial level, it can clean water. It can get rid of E. coli and stuff by being in that sort of marshy water. So, and it's there I put it also into the biomass producer group. It is just the most highly productive biomass plant you can think of for our climate, and even possibly, maybe Christchurch not so much anymore.
So to sum up that category, 5 favorite dynamic accumulators. We had comfrey for a summer, for during summer, paired up with sorrel for winter dynamic accumulator, cardoon, banana if you're in more subtropics, or canna lily and plantain if you're in more temperate regions, and cocksfoot, and if you've got it in the area and you are around to manage it, giant reed. All right.
But a giant reed is a messy plant to have in the system, so it's not ideal. If you have a limited grey area, a grey water area, somewhere safe, not in a waterway and so on, which you shouldn't have anyway, you could think about it. But theoretically it's the best, but it gets a bit messy. Now, one more thing with comfrey, there is an evergreen comfrey, but overall it's not as productive as the other one. So it just stretches the production over the year, but therefore less in summer.
Just having a giggle because we've got another comment here that we'll refer to later, but pampas grass grows wonderfully here, always ways to use it in best effect. So just in reference to that, pampas grass would be another great dynamic accumulator if you've got it in the area to manage it in the system and not phase it out.
Yeah, there's maybe another angle to things of accumulator. I mean, we talk in Syntropy about accumulation cycles. Plant communities belong to the accumulator system. So a lot of sedges like pampas grass would be in an accumulator system. However, their problem is they can accumulate well in a lean system. They do a great job there. But when the system matures, or matures rather, moves on to become more of an abundant system, plants like pampas grass, they don't suddenly turn into high performers just because the conditions are better. They just stay their own pace. They're just going along like that. And that's their weakness. There are other grasses that can switch from being a lean survivor and accumulator to becoming an abundant thriver and hyperaccumulator. Yeah, like eucalyptus can do that, and sugarcane can do that. But I don't think pampa grass can do that. And if you do inherit pampa grass in an area, definitely don't rip it out. But you might want to restrict it, leave it only in your tree rows where you can manage it easier. And on certain sites, I would, if I would have a certain type of site, I would even consider planting it, ripping it out somewhere where people don't want it, and put it, but in rows, where you run your hedge trimmer over. And you do that only if you find that there's pampa grass already on that section that you're going to work on. You don't bring it to a new section. But then you might bring in some more and put it on lines, and then over time get rid of the pampa grass that's not in lines, and have it reduced to just pampa grass that you have on the line where you can run the hedge trimmer over it before it even thinks about flowering. That's how you get it to accumulate more. Before it even starts making these little stems showing the tendency to flower, you run your mower over it already, your hedge trimmer, whatever. And then it's a beautiful mulch source. But if your soil is not in such a bad condition to demand that, I would definitely rather go with a much more sociably accepted elephant grass, or in cooler climates, cocksfoot and stuff like that.
Cool. Yeah. So we did jump ahead there, but I thought it was relevant to that
good
question just we had. Then going on, 5 favorite nitrogen fixes.
All right. Okay. Maybe I put the first one because it's also an amazing biomass producer and dynamic accumulator, if you want to call it that way. What is it? Guess.
I'm so glad this is a private group.
It's good to have a bit of a filter for that group. Flame tree, yes. I still love it. And then maybe a newly sort of refound interest in Brazilian buttercup shrub. And here's the contradiction. It is in the legume family, but it's not a nitrogen fixer. However, being such a good organic producer and dynamic accumulator in the sense that you can prune it and it bounces back, that is actually for us more important in that plant as a characteristic than now. It's not a nitrogen fixer, therefore we don't want it. No. It's not that easy. So for the nitrogen fixation, we have, of course, flame tree, but the long run survivors of that system shouldn't be the flame tree, it should be the Inga bean. So we have to make sure bean in the system that when they are fully developed and they develop this open vase-shaped natural sort of savanna type look to them, you somehow want to give them that shape. You cannot forever force them to just have a central leader when they don't want that. Yeah, they have to open up a bit into a umbrella, which is a sign of a tree that likes the emergent canopy. And of course, the flame trees would like to do the same, but we won't let them, not even now. And the flame tree would have to go first, and then the Inga beans will stay, and they will then become our long-term favorite. All right. But is it now for Christchurch climate?
Yeah.
Okay. Then I mean,
temper.
Yeah. If we could grow, Tagasaste here, we probably would love it because goats love it, and the tuis love it, and the wood pigeons love it. So we would definitely go to town on that. But it's not our favorite because there's so many that just perform better than that. As you would be, but for you, definitely it has to be on your favorite list. Yeah. And because of the easy prunability and it coming back and cold tolerance and even so you have a pan on a meter depth, you would still probably pull off the Tagasaste easy because you're altogether drier as well. Do we need more?
Yeah, 2 more.
And then brush wattle. Yeah, brush wattle is for us is our Tagasaste substitute on steroids here.
And then another one I thought was older.
Older, yeah. It's always a bit disappointing so far for us. We have them, we love them, but again, they're outperformed by others. Yeah. Then we use Acacia floribunda a bit. They're nicer than what we had here normally growing, almost naturalized from previous people here putting these things in as permaculture trees. They are a bit awkward and messy, whereas Acacia floribunda has a much more upright growth, which is easier to deal with when we slash it up or when we feed it to the goats and put it through chippers. 5 times easier to handle in longifolia. So when you choose acacias, watch out that you don't get the open gnarly ones. You want some that are more of a whippy growth that later on give you easier manageability.
So to sum that up, we've got for the top 5 nitrogen fixes, flame tree, if you again have it in your area, going to be there for life and can manage it, then it's got one of the biggest nodules, nitrogen fixing nodules out there, and just super fast growing, and for us really easy to maintain, but again that comes with a lot of cautions and warnings. Number 2 was Brazilian buttercup. Number 3, inga bean if you're more sort of subtropical zone, Tagasasti if you're in a temperate zone with free draining soil, brush bottles if you want something quick, fast, and again you're on top of it. And yeah, just in the first, it's got quite a short life cycle though, so you really want to stage that with something following through. Only lives in the system for about 3 years and then it sort of blows over with the wind. And number 5, alder, because it grows from seed, so you've got a great root system, but not as fast growing as it sort of describes on its profile. So alternatively, perhaps instead Acacia floribunda, which again with those ones you wouldn't want to ever prune it more than 30% of its biomass. So just keep that in mind with certain trees, how much you prune them in relation to what they need.
Over time, we will make videos on individual plant species out in the field to show their place and their behavior a bit individually. We will at some point get to that too.
And then our last top 5 sort of questions, we've got one for native trees, top 5 native trees. I'm just going to begin that with faux.
Yeah, if you're frost-free, or a faux would work if you have light frost. If you have already some canopy established, you can bring them in later because they're quite shade tolerant, which is a bit odd because they have such tiny seeds, but they do all right in shade. So it's a bit an odd one.
And then our other all-time favorite, the kohe kohe, which we actually did a whole long sort of feature film on the Happen Films Patreon page as well, if any one of you is on there. But we'll probably do a Patreon video on that as well. It's one of the top 50 cloud seeders in the world. So a really good native to integrate into a food forest system or native forest. Number 3, Koposma?
Mahoi.
Mahoi.
Definitely. I'd even put that higher up. I mean, yeah. But
Mahoi because it prunes really well, loves shade. Yeah.
And it grows throughout the whole country. You can, anywhere in Aotearoa, can you find a variety that suits your conditions.
And then
Rippenwood is another similar one. In some places, maybe more free draining, you might find Rippenwood could outperform it. But yeah, we want these evergreen shrubs that can take shade. We are always having a shortage of those. We always forget to put enough of those in. And the added benefit, of course, is the fodder that you get out of those.
So I've gone on Koposma for a third one.
It's a bit of a fiddly one often.
If you've got goats or cows, then Koposma could be a great one, along with the faux and the mahoi.
And kawa would
fodder crops as well.
Put above that.
What?
Kawa.
Another sort of temperate and subtropical region loving one.
Or if you are somewhere else, like say for instance Panama, as you are Fernanda, you might want to consider the kava, the Fijian kava, or from Hawaii, whatever, possibly as a crop as well, and it would do well in understory, just like our native kava, same family, Piperaceae. But yours would you would have the native South American kava, which gives you nothing to sell, but the kava would, yeah.
And then last one, Tecoca, the cabbage tree. Would you say?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should have put more of those in as well. Yeah. Yeah.
So top 5: Fo, Kohikoi, Mahoi, Kawakawa, and Tecoca. The Tecoca being one of our favorites because it's an emergent, which is really nice, and it's a monocot, but it actually has a taproot, so that's quite a nice exception. So for those people that don't know, monocots being like your grasses, bananas, onions, they have more fiber root systems. They don't actually have a taproot. And then monocots have the taproot system. So Tecoca is a rarity in the sense that it's a monocot, but it actually has a taproot. So yeah, really useful for soil stabilization, can handle wet and dry, and again, it's emergent and it feeds the birds, which is a really good asset. And a lot of the benefits with integrating natives into a syntropic food forest system is that a lot of natives handle the lower stratas. They can handle relatively more shade than a lot of our other exotic species. So that's usually this shortage that we come to when we're designing a food forest, is finding plants that occupy the lower, medium to low strata, and that's where your natives really come in.
Especially down where you are in Christchurch, Campbell, because there you would have much more of a presence of deciduous trees in your fruit trees, and that means over winter you have no biomass production apart from your ground layer. So you want that shrub layer to give you the biomass and the shelter in winter, when your deciduous trees are not going to give you much at all.
Cool. So that's the questions finished on the Patreon comments page. So now we're on to the live chat here. And it's great to see a comment by you, Mark, because I was a message with you last month that you weren't able to attend. So it's great to see you on here. And your question, and you're based in the Kaipara, and your question was interested in the sickles we're using. What make do you recommend?
We are going to do a tool film.
Yeah, we are going to do a full tool Patreon video going through all the different tools that we use in the different brands. But just to quickly answer your one specifically on sickles, the brand names I'm not sure, but we use one that's serrated and one that's not.
Yeah. Mostly nowadays we use the serrated ones.
Yeah. So the one, I don't know what the brands are though, but so there's two sort of variants of the sickles, but they're the Japanese ones. They're not the reap hook ones that go all the way around.
I think that Spanish ones. Yeah. There's only one brand that has short handles, short sickles, and to fit into our work pouches, we now carry those. Of course, they have a shorter blade, and for some things makes more work, but they're also sturdier. You can even use them sometimes to get stuff out of the soil. Yeah. So
my assistant Sean is actually just gonna go and get one. So we'll come back to your question actually, and then we've got something to refer to. So next question on from that. What's the scientific name of the brush bottles you use? I'm pretty sure I came across something that it is not.
Thank you.
What was it? Oh, come back. Albizia lofranta? Or did it change its name?
It changed its name, and I can't remember the new one, but it's an Albizia. You would still find it under that name anyway, lofranta. So it's a cousin of the silk tree acacia, the Albizia julibrissin, which would work too. if you're on a more free draining, richer soil like volcanics and so, that one could be a good choice. However, that cousin is deciduous, and it might not give you the shelter that you expect when we talk about albizia as a shelter, say, for avocado trees and other sensitive ones in the first season. So what is it? Barnell. Here we go. Barnell.
So that's the typical sickle that we use. So it's quite short. You can see the blade's quite short, but it's serrated there. So that makes it really good for quite acute management of fairly woody, but otherwise also clumps of grass. You know, you hold the clump of grass in your hand and sickle that through. So yeah, that's a really handy one. And then there's also a sickle, sort of similar shape to this, but it's not serrated. It's just smooth on both sides. And that's really good for doing more like a sort of whipping action on grasses. This is better for more woody stuff, and, you know, grabbing things in clumps are more sort of acute work. And the other one's good for mowing, basically. But yeah, you want to sort of avoid the reaping hook harvesters. That's more for like grains and grain harvesting as opposed to food forest management. But yeah.
The thing with tools, machete is always a bit dangerous for that, but that sickle gives you the opportunity to hold something and cut it, and you still have it in your whole hand to put it on the trailer, to put it in the tree rows, whatever. So that is the big advantage that you have over using a weed eater or something, where you have to go then again with a rake or something to put it where you want it. And for a lot of grasses, like we do cocksfoot often with a hedge trimmer now, but it's not that much slower, and you make a nicer job, but you have to be down on your knees or something like that, and that is a bit annoying. But otherwise, they're really fast when you get the use of them. And flax as well, you use them for flax, and yeah, all of those. Even titonias, when they're not too thick, they're fine. So for the first year, that's more your friend than your machete. And then you ease into your machete. But yeah, with bows, you should always wear a glove.
And here we've got a question from Alan from Otaki. And your question here, side note, great seeing your property, Alan, on our mentorship consultancy, and great to see you back on here. So we've got seaweed leachate for foliar spray, maximum time to set up to let steep. Was drying seaweed to store, but have been told to keep it in the water and let it go smelly. Thoughts on anaerobic leachates in general, e.g. comfrey? That's a question for you, class.
Hey, Alan. Yo, so sounds like I talked you into seaweed the other day. I have heard that you should not leave your seaweed in water for more than 2 or 3 weeks, because then the sugars that leach out, which are part of what makes them such a tonic on plants, they will then get broken down. You still have the trace elements, but most of your growth promoters would then be fermented into just simple nutrients. So there's a loss there if you leave it too long. Now, 2 weeks, 3 weeks could be too long in summer, possibly. In winter, you might be fine with 5 weeks, who knows? I notice whenever we use it, it turns the water brown very quickly. And so I think it doesn't take long at all to actually ooze what it needs to into the water. So we use ours after a couple of days already. But of course, then it depends on the dilution. If it's too diluted and you bring it out in winter, then it feels like there's too much water going on the land for no reason. In summer, you can turn it around and say, well, I'm just watering the plants in the evening on the underside and keep them cool, and at the same time they get some seaweed. So depending on the time of the year, you might want it more diluted, less diluted, and steep it longer, less, because of the different temperature. But if it starts getting smelly, I'd say you missed a sweet spot. I would not wait for it to be smelly.
Because then a lot of that is already wafting off into the
Yeah,
air, is that right?
yeah. And you can throw some EM in with it if you have it, or some indigenous microorganisms, whatever you have. They will also feed on the sugars that are released by the seaweed, but that's okay. It should be still enough to go into your plants. But yeah, anything foul, smelly, I think it's not the way to go with horticulture. A, it's unpleasant to work with, and B, it might not be dangerous, but imagine if you sell anything fresh and it has some stench on it, it's just not acceptable. So I somehow feel nowadays I only want to spray on our plants what I'm not concerned about getting in my mouth when I'm irrigating it or spraying it. So I think that's a good principle, because that's what happens anyway when you bring it out like we do. So you want to only spray stuff that you're not uncomfortable with getting a dash over your face. And a rotten smelling seaweed for me doesn't quite qualify for
that. So then we've got a question by Liz. I was given some sugar canes yesterday and just wondered what your favorite way to propagate it is. I've seen people rooting it in water or bearing either vertically or horizontally in soil. So yeah, main way of propagating sugarcane is generally direct in the areas that we want it. So by stakes, so most sugarcane canes, if you get it, sort of snap it off from the bottom, you'll have a lot of hair, like root hairs already sort of establishing themselves at the bottom. That bottom section of the sugarcane stake is the most viable plant propagating zone. And then from then on, you've got nodes that are not as mature, meaning they take longer to take root. So if you are in an area where, or coming into summer, any sort of drought issues, you're going to have more success with the lower zone of the stake, the ones that are already, the nodules that have already opened up and are starting to form roots, than you are further up the cane. So if you have only got access to stakes further up, or you want to make use of your whole stake, you can plant the lower section pretty much directly into whatever zone you want with quite good success. And your success rate lowers the further up the cane you go, in which case you want to make sure that you have at least 2 to 3 nodules of the section that you have in the ground, of whatever section you have, whether that's vertically or horizontally. So you don't want to, chop up your cane into 2 smaller blocks. The smaller you go, like, you can get away with just doing really little chunks of sugarcane with just 1 nodule if you have them horizontally in a really good seed raising mix and you've got regular irrigation and you get them going. But it will be a lot slower, and you have to do that phase outside of the soil, like outside of the place that you want to. You have to nurse them through that time. So yeah, depends on the situation in which you want to propagate them in. If you've got access to a whole load, by all means do the top zones, chop them up into little pieces. If you want lots of planting material and you've got the space to raise them in potting trays, and you can irrigate them frequently, and then as soon as they start germinating and sprouting their shoots, you can transplant them. If you want to direct plant them, either do stakes that are long enough that you can get them 2 or 3 nodules deep into the ground, or you use the lower section of the stake that have already matured their root systems, and then you can direct transplant them pretty much anywhere. That's a bit of a summarize.
Yep.
Cool.
I think I've went ahead too far.
Yeah, don't know.
Yeah.
Then we've got Cam and Nikki from the Loop crew asking, when first starting out, where do you recommend sourcing all the plants for a guild, for example, an avocado guild, so you can plant everything at once? Probably a mix of setting up a bit of your own nursery, propagation nursery, especially for those things that are your sort of pioneers or your biomass plants that you don't often find in nurseries, or if you do, they're outrageously expensive. Like, for example, sugarcane you can buy at nurseries, but they're like $30 for one pot. So if you are doing a whole guild or a whole plantation, that starts getting a bit pricey. So all those things that you can propagate yourself quite easily, like sugarcane, banana grass, tittonia, brushwattle seeds, all those things that you can come across on the roadsides or from contacts and propagate yourself. Starting your own little starter nursery, is a really good idea. And then the other sort of trees that are a bit more specialty or support species, like let's say faux or tamarillo. What else do we have in that avocado guild?
Elephant grass.
Banana grass. Oh. Those sort of things. There are a few nurseries that are starting to use them, propagate them a lot more. There is one nursery in particular I would recommend, Twin Falls Nursery, that's starting out as a permaculture nursery. So they're going into a lot more of those sort of pioneers, food forest guild like plants. So that'll be a good nursery to keep an eye on the website as they release more sort of quite exotic trees, as well as the permaculture pioneer trees. Then for sort of bulk pioneer plants such as your alders or your eucalypts or wattles of some sort, they've got a whole variety, would be either Southern Woods or Pioneer Nursery in New Zealand. They're two good nurseries for bulk pioneer trees. For sugarcane, banana grasses, all that, we supply a bit. Otherwise, there are, keep an eye out for especially banana grass on roadsides, elephant grass, Rhododendron, all those ones, roadsides. Sugarcane, usually either from small producers like us, otherwise there are some sort of wild zones. But in short, when starting out, because you do want to plant it ideally all at once, accumulate all your plants first, either from your own sourcing of propagating in your nursery, or start accumulating them from the different nurseries, holding them and then planting them out all at once together. And that's pretty much as much as we can say.
Just watch it. I mean, there's a business opportunity for most of you guys out there. It's one of the fastest growing pyramid schemes you can be part of. And as it happening with Tittonia at the moment, I guess. So ideally, everyone's starting out with syntropy systems. We are so few and far between us still that you have to become your own nursery. You can't rely on somebody to sell out of half of the things that you actually need to get your blog going. And you have seen in some of the videos, and we show you more of that actually a lot of our syntropy rows down in the more fertile soil in the market garden are actually double functioning as nursery areas as well. So watch the space. We are doing all of that in combination, and so could you. Look at your food forest rows as nursery areas, because at some point you need to thin. Well, thinning doesn't necessarily mean you kill those plants. You can also use them somewhere else or sell them or whatever, or give them away.
And especially if you're starting in small guilds, basically your first guild can then source all those plants from your different areas, and that might take a while, or source from around. But once you've got that one initial guild, that can be your seed block of knowledge and experience in terms of having planted it out and getting the exposure to it, as well as your seed block of actual materials to then replicate and plant out more guilds. So breaking your space up that way is quite helpful, and means that then you've got all the resources, all the cuttings, seeds from that one guild to replicate on, and that's your nursery per se.
That's another added question from Nick and Cam still. Can you plant Tittonia directly into bare clay? Answer is yes, only if you have clay. And you guys don't have clay. So where do we get the clay from?
Asking for other people.
But yes, you can, and we have done it a lot of times, even in quite poor clay, into kaikuyu on clay. It works. Of course, you don't have 100% strike rate, but it's usually good enough if you pick the right time of the year, moist enough, not too cold, not too dry too soon, and so on and so on. Yeah.
Again, the main point there is to try and bury your stakes at least 3/4 of the depth into the soil. So yeah, don't just go as far as you can shove it in, or just a spade deep. Go 2/3 of the 2/3 of the length of your stake in the soil, and then you should be fine in clay, or you will be fine. And then Kirsten asked a question. Hi, I'm in Northland retrofitting a traditional orchard. So you must have enjoyed our latest video on that. You're asking, planting densely amongst kikuyu. Your last video, you roughly weeded the area first, but then just release plantings. Any other advice?
Right. I think I answered that because I was doing that. So I showed our woofer how to get these rows prepared by coming in with a spade. So here's the row that we marked previously, Tonias, and as you had seen, quite a few of them didn't make it for whatever reason. We sometimes don't understand it. Might be the time of the year, could be other factors. So 3 row, and then come in with a spade a bit in an angle like that, then with a spade from here, and then just cutting into it, not mixing it up yet, and then coming crosswise and just wiggling a bit, not turning over, anything like that, just so the kikuyu is cut into little blocks like that, without disturbing too many worms, because there were so many worms in there. It felt criminal to do anything, even that. And then I got him to just pick the kikuyu and sort of shake it and take it out without spending too much time on it. The idea being that I can then go and plant certain things like the garlic or whatever, and then later when I feel the impulse to pull on some of the kikuyu runner that might show up in the first half year, and there's an impulse when you go through and do something, you still want to pull some, then you don't rip the garlic out with it and so on. And for the first half year, if you do combine it with certain annual crops, you will feel like you want to pull a bit on kikuyu. Again, not to try to eradicate it, but just to knock it back a bit. And nothing big deal. But just as part of the management, it's just something you do. You pull on a bit of here and there, and that makes that part a lot easier. We got most of that carpet out by just grabbing it, shaking it, taking it out. The big part of the work would have been trying to get every bit out of it. That would have really slowed us down. But that initial shake, not a big deal. You could also do it with a rotary hoe if you have big enough areas open for that and you have the machine. However you do that, doesn't matter. But you want to create this wee bit of a strip that looks a bit like a garden bed with loose soil in case you want to throw some seeds in there. Just makes planting easier than having to go with every spade through a few runners of kikuyu. And so just for that, and we put only rough compost on it that we barely worked into it because the soil was rich. If we would do it on a slope and we had all the compost that we do have, we would have been more generous with the compost, maybe have tried to dig it in a bit deeper so it doesn't wash off the surface. Yeah, because we're starting out with another cycle that might last for 50 years or something like that. So that's the only time when we do something to the soil, getting a few bones in, a bit of charcoal and a bit of whatnot. And that was all we did. And you don't have to do it. If you just do Titonia and you don't have to, but it just felt easier doing that bit of preparation.
So here we've got a question from Alan, again from Otaki. Best practice for planting a tree, depth and width of hole, pruning roots, spreading roots or not, any special techniques, thoughts on planting guide in edible food forest gardens, especially leaving undisturbed soil. So principally, planting a hole, you want to, well, depending again on what soil you've got, if you've got very free draining volcanic soil, then your planting hole depth and width doesn't have to be as big as if you were on clay. So let's say you're on clay, worst case situation, just for those out there, your hole, you really want to go as big and as wide as you can, but ideally sort of 3/4 of a meter across and about, yeah, half a meter down. Really work in the bottom, adding your soil amendments like your sand and your biochar once you get to the bottom of the hole, and really, you know, stir it up and dig down, fluffing it up so you don't have this sort of clean slated hole from your spade marks, because that's basically just going to create this sort of sheen, quite impermeable layer. So you want to sort of hack around on the edges and the bottom, keep that quite loose and open before planting a tree, and then mixing again your soil amendments into the stuff that you've taken out of the hole. Mixing it outside of the hole saves a lot of time, and make sure you've got it all mixed in well. So again, putting your biochar, your compost, and sand if you're on clay into that soil, mixing it up there as you're putting it back into the hole around your tree root. If you've got a special from a nursery of plants and you think you're really lucky because you're walking away with a deal, probably means that your trees are actually root bound and they've been in the nursery for a long time, and that's why they're on special, which means that, yeah, your roots are sort of root bound around your planting pot. So if that's the case, you really want to untangle those roots, and especially that main taproot, you want to sort of unwind that and make sure you've sort of elongated that and opened it all up before filling all that soil in. Otherwise, it's just going to stay knotted like that and grow for maybe a year or two, and then just fall over in the wind because it's just got no grab in the soil. So yeah, that's pretty crucial if you've got root bound trees. If your trees are quite freshly established in the container and they're not root bound, then actually as little to no disturbance in the transplanting as possible is ideal. It'll just give it that less transplanting shock, keeping all that moisture and all the root relationships with the soil intact, and then just placing it in the hole and then gently compacting all the soil around that container root system in place. The main principle, even if you have extended the roots in some cases or directly transplanted planting pot in, is to gently sort of put your fingers around the tree that you're planting, compacting that soil in, not compacting in the sense that you're completely squishing it down and creating an anaerobic compaction in this sense, in terms of you're really layering and pushing down that soil really snugly around the whole plant and not having an area of air between the roots and the soil, because that's where you get drying out and again transplanting shock. So you really want to make it snug in the ground. You don't really want to sit it too loose in the ground, especially if you're coming into summer, because if that soil and root contact isn't nice and snug and you've got sort of air gaps everywhere, then you're going to create a lot of drought and dry zones, which is just going to kill your plant or have a really hard time during summer. Another point with planting, depending on the soil topography, if you're on flat ground, then obviously planting it position straight is fine. And you just want to be aware of the orientation of the tree regarding to where north is, or south if you're in the northern hemisphere, wherever the sun is. If you've got a tree that's leaning quite drastically in one direction, you don't want to then plant it where it's still leaning towards north. You want to counteract that away from the sun, so as it grows up, it grows straight rather than just growing further more and more horizontally, as all trees will naturally gravitate towards the sun. So you want to counteract that in position to where it is in the hole. And also, if you are on a slope and you've got a tree, naturally all the trees will sort of go downwards with the slope as they mature and settle into the hole. So again, when you plant the tree in a slope, counteract that by planting it on an angle up towards the hill, so that as it's growing, it's go into then full balance rather than going all the way down. So that's just little tips for sun orientation and topography. Pruning roots. So if you're dealing with monocots such as grasses or legumes or sort of root crops, crowns, bananas, you want to take off all the roots and give them a clean start. So for bananas, for example, we chop off the whole top, all the roots off, and just keep the core onion. We do the same with cannella leaves, turmeric if we're transplanting that, sort of tubers, monocots, grasses as well. When you're transplanting those, you want to give a little chop on the roots as well as the grass as well, so to give them a nice clean start. For your other trees such as avocados and whatnot, your main dicots, you wouldn't necessarily want to root prune them. You want to keep that as intact. But if you're heading into summer or they've got a lot of leaf foliage, you might want to chop some of those leaves in half or all of those leaves in half. That again will mitigate the transplanting shock. They're not going to have to keep all that biomass alive and full of water in that time. Chopping them in half just reduces the amount of water that plant has to supply, and it can instead focus on establishing its roots in its ground. So yeah, again, coming to summer, if you're transplanting trees and they've got lots of leaves, give them a chop in half. Yeah, can't think of any other little tips. Did I leave anything out?
No.
Yeah, I think that's about covered it. But yeah, I think you mentioned your volcanic soil, right? This one? Yeah. So your hole width and depth can be relatively in relation to just outside the width and depth of the plant that you have in mind. But yeah, if you're on clay, go big and go hard. Really open up that soil. And also just a point on if you are on clay, even if you're not, if you've got a clay pan or something, planting a tree, if it's a bit sensitive, if it would like free draining soil, or you can actually plant a tree that does really well in that environment, like a pioneer tree, like ukes or brush bottles or poplars, or something that will actually go down and sort of charge the way much faster than your tree. So for example, planting a uke and an avocado is a really good companion, because the avocado will take a lot longer to actually establish that root system, and in the meantime the uke will grow really fast, create that sort of shade and canopy for the avocado, as well as channeling those root systems for your avocado tree. And then once your avocado gets into its maturity, you phase out the eucalypts, and as all those rotting root systems of the eucalypt underground can then be pathways that then the avocado can follow. So that's a way of digging further down and extending your planting hole through using succession of other plants to sort of pioneer the way below ground as well as above ground. As another planting tip. Now we've got a question from Georgia. Hey Georgia, what have been your experiences with growing turmeric and some types of ginger? Do you want to answer that, or sure?
Not terribly successful, unfortunately. In the greenhouse they do all right, but takes a while to get really into gear, and they don't like it too sunny and too hot. So they actually should be in a light understory. But in our food forest, it's usually a bit too shady, and we didn't include them in the beginning. We only thought about it much later. So including them later, even in windows within the food forest, is not that easy. But we did some in our frosty market gardens in tropic rows, and so far they look actually quite promising. So even though it's colder there, they seem to prefer growing on a richer soil and a bit more light than up in the food forest where we have the subtropicals. So yeah, we keep watching that, but looks good.
There is someone, not personal experience, but there is someone that's had great success in planting them in actual sort of planted boxes where they've got corrugated on the bottom and then a whole heap of sort of sand or gravel to offer that free draining soil. Then they've got a layer of compost, and then on the very layer